At my son's business reception for partners and investors in front of 80 guests, he took the microphone and said, "You should feel lucky I still keep your picture hanging in the back of the kitchen." His wife laughed as everyone watched me sitting there alone. I didn't argue. I simply walked away. The next morning, a lawyer handed me an old hospital bracelet from 33 years ago. He looked straight into my eyes and said, "Everything is just beginning. So glad you're here on Dad's Revenge Stories. Tell me below, which city or country are you watching from today?" A quick note. Certain elements are fictionalized for narrative impact and life lessons. Resemblances to actual names or places are accidental, but the core takeaway is deeply meaningful. The night my son took everything from me, he was wearing a tie I had bought him. I noticed that first, before the microphone, before the crowd, before the words that would follow me home and sit at the foot of my bed for weeks afterward. It was the navy silk tie I had picked up at Nordstrom 2 Christmases ago, the one he had unwrapped and held up and said, "Dad, this is actually really nice." I remember feeling quietly proud of that. A small thing. The kind of small thing a father collects over the years and stores somewhere warm, proof that he still knows his son. I stopped knowing my son sometime in the last 2 years. I just didn't realize it until he picked up that microphone. The party was Daniel's idea, which I should have understood as the first sign. Maggie had been gone for 41 days. 41 days since I had stood at her grave in Forest Lawn Cemetery and felt the particular silence of a man who has just lost the person who made sense of his life. 41 days was not enough time for grief to finish what it started. It wasn't enough time to sort through her clothes or decide what to do with her reading glasses still folded on the nightstand. It certainly wasn't enough time to host 80 business partners and investors in the event space of the bakery she had helped me build from nothing. But Daniel had sent the invitations before I knew there were invitations to send. Owen's Bakery occupied the ground floor of a building on West 3rd Street that I had leased in 1984 with money I didn't entirely have and confidence I was mostly pretending. 40 years later, the event space in the back could seat 100 people comfortably. That evening, it held 80, and every one of them had a glass of champagne and a name tag, and the particular energy of people who believe they are about to witness something important. I sat at a small round table near the kitchen doors. Not at the front, not at the center, at the edge where the waitstaff moved in and out and the noise from the kitchen occasionally swallowed the jazz trio Daniel had hired. I had not been told where to sit. I had simply walked in, read the room, and understood immediately where I belonged in the arrangement my son had designed. Amanda was already at the front table when I arrived. She was wearing a white dress and pearl earrings, and she leaned over to say something into Daniel's ear when she saw me come in, and he nodded without looking up. She had been doing that for 2 years, the leaning, the murmuring, the small corrections she made to his attention throughout the day. I had told Maggie once that Amanda reminded me of a pilot adjusting course so gradually that the passengers never felt the change. Maggie had looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Richard, you've been reading too many thrillers." She was probably right. She usually was. The jazz trio finished their set at 8 o'clock. A man from Daniel's office tapped the microphone twice, said a few words about legacy and vision and the future of Los Angeles's culinary landscape, and then introduced my son as though he were presenting a keynote speaker at a conference rather than a 33-year-old man at his own father's company party. Daniel walked to the front of the room to applause. He was tall, my son taller than me, which had always made me quietly happy the way a farmer is happy when the next season's crop surpasses the last. He held the microphone with the ease of someone who had practiced, and he smiled at the room, and the room smiled back. And for one brief and foolish moment, I felt the old warmth move through my chest. The feeling I had carried since the night I first held him 33 years ago in a hospital room. while rain moved across the parking lot lights outside. Hospital room while snow fell past the window. "Thank you all for being here," Daniel said. "Tonight is the beginning of something. Not just for Owen's Bakery, but for what this brand can become." He paused, letting the room settle into his rhythm. "My father built something real. 40 years of early mornings and flour on his hands, and a product that people in this city genuinely love. I respect that." Another pause. "And now it's time for the next chapter." He looked toward my table. "Not at me through me. The way you look through a window at what's behind it." "Dad," he said, and his voice carried perfectly because he had thought about the acoustics. "You should feel lucky. I still let your photo hang in the back of the kitchen. Most CEOs would have taken your name off the door 2 years ago." He tilted his head slightly the way a man does when he believes he is being generous. "You built the foundation. I'll build the house." Amanda laughed. It was not a polite laugh, not the kind you offer when something lands awkwardly and you want to smooth it over. It was a full, satisfied laugh, the laugh of a woman who had waited a long time to be in the room when these words were spoken. It lasted 4 seconds. I counted because my brain, in moments of shock, defaults to the habits of a man who has spent 40 years measuring things. 3 people at the nearest table laughed, with her uncertain checking each other's faces, the way people do when they can't tell if something is a joke. 2 women near the back looked at each other and did not laugh at all. The jazz drummer set down his brushes. My chest did not tighten. My eyes did not fill. I had spent 40 years learning to be steady in the moments that wanted to break me at 3 in the morning in a neonatal ward, watching a machine breathe for a child who had no name yet. At the bank in 1987 when the loan officer told me I was 1 bad quarter away from losing everything. At Maggie's bedside in the last week, holding her hand while she slept, and understanding that steadiness was the only gift I still had left to give her. I was steady now. I picked up my water glass and set it down again. I folded my napkin once along the existing crease. I pushed my chair back from the table and stood up, and I took my coat from the back of the chair, the old canvas jacket I'd owned since 2003, soft at the elbows, reliable in the way that only old things are, and I walked toward the door. 80 people watched me go. I know because I could feel it, the weight of that many eyes tracking one person across a room. Nobody called after me. Not Daniel. Not Amanda. Not a single one of the 80 people who had eaten my food and attended my events and shaken my hand over 4 decades of Tuesday mornings and Christmas orders and a birthday cake once for a mayor. I pushed through the side door and stepped out onto West 3rd Street, and the July air hit me warm and smelling faintly of exhaust and the jasmine someone had planted in the planter boxes 2 years ago at Amanda's suggestion. Through the glass, I could see the room already moving on the jazz trio, picking back up glasses being refilled. Daniel shaking hands at the front. My name was still on the sign above the door. Owen's Bakery, in the dark green lettering I had chosen myself in 1984 because Maggie said it looked honest. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time. Then I turned up my collar and started walking toward the bus stop, because I had given the car to Daniel 2 months ago when he said he needed it, and I had not thought to ask for it back. That night in the room I was renting on Cochrane Avenue for $650 a month. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. The knuckles were larger than they used to be. The skin moved differently now, looser over the bones. 40 years of mixing and kneading and lifting and building, and these were the hands that had done it. The same hands that had 33 years ago carried a 4-pound infant through a hospital lobby while a nurse called ahead to the neonatal unit, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and I told myself over and over that everything was going to be fine. I did not sleep. At some point after midnight, the room felt very small. I turned off the lamp and lay back on the bedspread without getting under it, And I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the way Daniel had looked through me rather than at me. And I thought about Amanda's laugh 4 seconds long, and I thought about Maggie's reading glasses still on the nightstand in a house that was no longer mine to enter. At 9 the following morning, someone knocked on my door. 2 knocks evenly spaced the knock of a man billing by the hour. I was already awake. I had never stopped being awake. I had learned over 70 years of living that the weight of a knock tells you something about the person behind it. Delivery drivers knocked fast and moved on before the door opened. Neighbors knocked soft and apologetic, as though interrupting were a personal failing. Salespeople knocked with manufactured cheerfulness, 3 quick raps that tried to sound friendly and only managed to sound rehearsed. This knock was 2 beats, measured, patient. The knock of a man who understood that what he was carrying required the person on the other side to be ready. I looked through the peephole before I touched the chain. 60, maybe 62. Silver hair combed with a clean part, the kind men of a certain generation maintained out of habit rather than vanity. Charcoal overcoat not new but well kept. A leather briefcase at his side old enough to have a history. He was not looking at his phone. He was not shifting his weight or checking the hallway. He stood square to the door and waited, and that stillness told me more than his clothes did. I slid the chain off and opened the door. Mr. Owens. His voice was measured the same way his knock had been. My name is James Holloway. I'm an estate attorney. I apologize for the hour and for arriving unannounced. He reached into the breast pocket of his overcoat and produced a business card, holding it up at eye level without extending it past the threshold, giving me the choice of whether to take it. I represented your wife, Margaret Owens. I have something that belongs to you. I took the card. Holloway and Associates Estate Law and Succession Planning, an address on Wilshire Boulevard. I looked at it for 4 seconds, then stepped back from the door. Come in, I said. He entered the room the way careful men enter unfamiliar spaces, taking in the dimensions without appearing to noting the single chair, the small table, the window that looked out onto Cochrane Avenue and the dry California morning. He did not comment on the room. He set his briefcase flat on the table and waited until I had moved to stand across from him before he opened it. But Mr. Owens, before I show you what I've brought, I want to explain why I'm here this morning specifically. He spoke in the deliberate way of a man who had rehearsed, not for effect, but for accuracy, because accuracy mattered to him more than impression. Mrs. Owens came to me 14 months before her passing. She gave me instructions. She was very clear that what I'm about to show you was to remain in my custody until one of 2 things happened. Either she told me otherwise, or a specific set of circumstances arose. He paused. Last night qualified as those circumstances. My chest pulled tight. You were at the party. I was not. But I have contacts in that community, and Mrs. Owens had asked me to remain informed. He reached into the briefcase and removed a single item. A clear plastic sleeve sealed along one edge with evidence tape, the kind used to preserve documents in legal proceedings. Inside the sleeve was a hospital bracelet. It had aged to the color of old paper, the white plastic gone soft and yellowed the way things do when they've been kept rather than discarded. Through the plastic, I could read the printed label on the face of the band. Baby boy unnamed, received 12/14/1991. The floor did not move. I did not reach for the table. But something behind my sternum shifted, slow and tectonic, the way things shift when a truth you have been carrying without knowing it finally finds its shape. That's the intake bracelet from Children's Hospital Los Angeles, Holloway said. December 14th, 1991. The night you brought in an infant you had found behind your bakery on West 3rd Street. He let that sit for a moment, giving me the space to confirm or deny, though we both understood there was nothing to deny. The bracelet was assigned to the child upon intake before any name had been established. It was standard procedure for foundling admissions. An infant brought in without documentation received a temporary band that stayed on until legal guardianship paperwork was filed. He looked at me steadily. Your wife obtained this from the hospital records archive in 2019 when Children's Hospital digitized their pre-2000 physical files. She paid a document retrieval fee of $60, signed the request under her name as legal guardian of record, and brought it to my office in a sealed envelope with written instructions. My throat was doing something I didn't have a word for. Not closing, tightening the way a rope tightens when weight is added gradually and then all at once. Why? I asked. The word came out rougher than I intended. Why did Maggie keep this Holloway set both hands flat on the table, not on the briefcase, not on the sleeve, on the plain surface between us the way a man does when he wants to be believed, without props? Because she loved you, he said. And because she understood that your son was going to try to use a claim he didn't have the right to make. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. But she understood the direction things were moving, and she wanted you to have something that told the truth before he could finish telling his version of it. He looked at me without flinching. She called it insurance. She told me, and I am quoting her because she asked me to, she said, "Richard won't need this unless everything goes wrong. And if everything goes wrong, this is the only thing that will make it right." I pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the table and breathed. Through the plastic sleeve, through 41 days of grief and last night's party, and the sound of Amanda's satisfied laugh, I looked at those 12 typed words. Baby boy unnamed received 12/14/1991. The night I had carried him through those hospital doors, his body no larger than a folded newspaper, his breathing shallow and fast and terrifyingly fragile. The night I had sat on a plastic chair in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and industrial carpet cleaner, and told a nurse when she asked if I was family that I was the only person who had shown up which seemed close enough. What does this change? I asked. Holloway picked up the sleeve carefully and set it on my side of the table. It changes everything, he said. Or nothing. That depends entirely on what you decide to do next, Mr. Owens. He closed the briefcase, fastened the latches one and then the other. I'll leave my card. Take whatever time you need. But I would ask that you call me before the end of the week, because there are other documents in Mrs. Owens's file that you need to see, and some of them have dates attached to them that won't wait indefinitely. He buttoned the top button of his overcoat. Your wife was a thorough woman. She thought of nearly everything. A pause at the door. She thought of you specifically, and she thought of you first. Then he was gone, and I was alone with a piece of plastic older than my son's name. 33 years ago, it was raining the same way it had rained the night before. I sat at the small table in my room on Cochrane Avenue with the sealed plastic sleeve in front of me and the morning light coming flat through the window, and I understood that the bracelet was not asking me to make a decision. It was asking me to remember. Those are 2 different things, and I had spent enough years confusing them to know the difference now. December 14th, 1991. I had been 37 years old unmarried, and 7 years into building a business that still felt on most mornings like it was held together with optimism and commercial-grade flour. The bakery on West 3rd was smaller than 1 storefront, 1 oven, 2 part-time employees who were more reliable in theory than in practice. I was closing up alone that night because the last employee had gone home sick, and I had told him to go, which was the kind of decision you make at 37 when you still believe your own endurance is a permanent condition. It was past 11 when I finished cleaning the proofing racks. The rain had started around not the polite drizzle that Los Angeles usually offered in December, but a genuine rain, the kind that made the storm drains on 3rd Street sound like they were clearing their throats. I was carrying a bag of flour sacks to the recycling bin in the alley behind the building when I heard it. Not a cry. Not exactly. It was smaller than that, a sound at the outer edge of sound, the kind you feel before you fully hear it, a vibration in the chest, more than a noise in the ears. I stopped walking. The rain came down on the dumpster lids, and the asphalt, and the plastic recycling bin, and made its various sounds, and underneath all of those sounds was this other thing, thin and urgent and wrong in the way that things are wrong when they are alive, and should not be where they are. I set the flour sacks down and moved toward the sound. The styrofoam box was wedged between the dumpster and the brick wall, partially sheltered by a piece of cardboard someone had leaned there weeks ago and forgotten. It was the kind of box restaurants used for seafood delivery, white, 2 feet long with a cracked lid that had been pushed down but not sealed. I crouched in the rain and lifted the lid with both hands, and the sound became a sound, and I understood what I was looking at before my mind caught up with what my eyes were seeing. He was smaller than I had any frame of reference for. Later at the hospital, they would tell me he was premature, approximately 34 weeks gestational age, they estimated, which meant he had arrived roughly 6 weeks before the world was ready for him. He was wrapped in a gray sweatshirt, adult-sized, folded around him in overlapping layers by someone who had, in the last moment, tried. His face was the dark red of a person working very hard to do something, and the sound he was making was the sound of that effort. He was cold. I could feel it when I reached in with both hands, the chill of him through the sweatshirt, the particular cold of something that has been outside too long in December rain. My hands were shaking so hard I had to stop and press them flat against my thighs for 3 full seconds before I trusted myself to pick him up. I carried him through the back door of the bakery. The oven was still warm from the evening bake, and I laid him on the stainless steel prep counter and called 911 with hands that were not entirely under my control and told the dispatcher what I had found. She asked me his condition. I told her he was breathing, that he was moving his arms, that he was making noise, which I understood by then was a good sign. She told me to keep him warm and stay on the line. I found a stack of clean baker's cloths, the white cotton kind, used for proofing dough, and I wrapped him in 4 of them, layered the way you layer anything you don't want to lose heat. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. I know because I counted them from the moment I hung up. At Children's Hospital Los Angeles on Vermont Avenue, a nurse with short red hair and the calm authority of someone who had seen everything took him from my arms and said, "You did good getting him warm. That matters with a preemie." She said it the way people say things they mean but have also said before, and it landed differently than comfort usually did. It landed like information, factual and steadying. I held onto it for the rest of that night, the way you hold onto a handrail in the dark. They put me in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and the particular indoor-outdoor smell of a building in Los Angeles in the rain. I sat in a plastic chair with armrests that had been repaired with electrical tape, and I watched the clock above the vending machine move from 11:43 to 12:15 to 1:08, and I did not call anyone because there was no one to call who would have understood what I was waiting for. At 2 in the morning, the red-haired nurse came back and said he was stable. Lungs were weak but working. He was in the neonatal intensive care unit, which she called the NICU, the way everyone in that building called it, a word that had become its own language. She said I could see him briefly if I wanted. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I am not a man who reaches for large words when small ones are available. But when the nurse led me to the window of the NICU and pointed to the isolette where he lay 4 pounds and some ounces of person wired to monitors that tracked his heartbeat in green lines across a small screen. Something happened in my chest that I do not have a precise name for. Not love exactly, not yet. Something before love. Something that recognized before the rest of me caught up that this was mine to carry now. Through the glass under the warmed lights of the isolette, his hand was curled against his cheek. I pressed my palm flat against the cold window and told him out loud, quietly enough that only I could hear it, that his name was Daniel. That I did not know where he came from or whose he had been, but that he was in a warm place now, and I was not going anywhere, and everything was going to be fine. I had meant every word of it. I sat back from the table on Cochrane Avenue and looked at the bracelet through the sealed plastic sleeve and understood for the first time in 33 years that the man who had made that promise in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning had been telling the truth. He had not gone anywhere. He had given the boy a name and a business and 40 years of early mornings, and had never once, not once, asked to be thanked for it. The bracelet did not move. It sat on the table and held its shape the same way it had held it for 33 years, waiting for the moment when the truth it contained would matter more than the silence that had protected it. I picked up James Holloway's card from beside it and turned it over in my hands. Then I set it back down, face up, and went to make coffee because I was going to need to think clearly, and thinking clearly had always started for me with something warm in my hands. The first thing Daniel took was not the money. It was not the building or the equipment or the client accounts that represented 40 years of relationships, built one order at a time. The first thing he took was the recipe book, and he took it on a Tuesday while I was still leaving flowers at Maggie's grave. I did not know this immediately. I found out the way I found out most things that summer from someone else after the fact, when the damage was already done, and only the understanding of it remained. Pete Saunders called on a Wednesday morning 8 days after the party. Pete had been supplying me with flour since 1986, hard red winter wheat from a mill in Utah, the kind with enough protein content to give bread its structure without turning it dense. He was 67 years old and drove a truck he had owned since 2004, and had on 3 separate occasions over 25 years extended me credit when I needed it without being asked and without attaching conditions to the generosity. He was the kind of man who did not call unless he had something to say. Richard, he said when I picked up. I got a call yesterday from your son. Something in his voice told me to sit down. I sat. He terminated the supply contract, Pete said, effective immediately. Said Owen's Bakery was transitioning to industrial-scale sourcing and that our product, and I'm quoting him here because I wrote it down, no longer fits the company's operational direction. A pause. 3 minutes, Richard. The whole call was 3 minutes. 25 years, and he gave me 3 minutes. Pete's voice cracked on the last sentence. Not all the way. Pete was not a man who let things crack all the way, but enough that I heard it a hairline fracture in the steadiness he had maintained for the whole call up to that point. My throat tightened in response the way it does when someone else's pain lands before your own does. I'm sorry, Pete, I said. The words came out flat because I meant them too much to dress them up. That should not have happened. None of it should have happened the way it did. I know you didn't know, he said. That's why I called. I figured you ought to know. I thanked him and ended the call and sat at the table in my room and felt the specific anger of a man who has been generous with something irreplaceable and watched someone else throw it away without understanding what it cost. Pete Saunders had floated me through the fall of 1989 when a bad equipment purchase nearly broke the business, He had driven that truck down from the warehouse in Chatsworth every Tuesday for 25 years. Daniel had ended it in 3 minutes from what I suspected was a chair that cost more than Pete's monthly income. I took the bus to West 3rd Street that afternoon. Not to go inside. I no longer had a key, having handed my copy to Daniel 6 weeks earlier when he told me the locks were being rekeyed for the new security system, and he would get me a replacement, and then did not. I stood on the sidewalk outside the front window and looked in at the afternoon light falling across the display case and the counter and the back wall where for 30 years we had kept a chalkboard with the day's specials written in Maggie's handwriting. The chalkboard was gone. In its place was a backlit menu board, the kind you saw at chain coffee shops, white lettering on black, the prices in a sans serif font that had nothing to do with anything Maggie had ever touched. Donna Mills found me standing there. Donna was 72 and had lived in the same house on Hauser Boulevard since 1978. She had been my first customer 7 in the morning on March 3, 1984, when I had opened the doors of Owen's Bakery for the first time, and she had walked in off the sidewalk in a raincoat and bought a sourdough loaf and said, "This is very good," in the tone of a woman who did not offer opinions she did not mean. She had come in every Monday morning since then for 40 years. She was not a sentimental woman. She did not make grand gestures. Which was exactly why when she pressed a folded piece of notepaper into my hand on the sidewalk outside the window, I understood that something had genuinely moved her to action. I unfolded it standing there on the sidewalk. Her handwriting was precise and small. "It doesn't taste like you anymore, Richard." 8 words. I read them twice, then folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. "Ah, the sourdough," she said, looking past me through the window at the display case. "The crust is wrong. It's too uniform. Real sourdough has irregularity. The fermentation process creates inconsistency in the crust, and that inconsistency is the flavor. What they're selling now is made with commercial yeast and a lot of hope." She turned to look at me directly. "He changed the recipe." "I know," I said. Though I had not known not until that moment when the certainty of it settled into place. "The whole point of a living starter," she continued, and there was a steadiness in her voice that I recognized as controlled anger, the kind that older women develop after decades of being dismissed for caring about things that matter, "is that it has a history. You can't replicate it. You can imitate it, but the imitation is always thinner." She looked at me. "Someone sold the original." I went back to the room on Cochrane Avenue and went through every surface I could reach by phone: former employees, suppliers, the accountant at the firm that had handled our books for 12 years. What I learned assembled from pieces was this. The recipe book, a green canvas notebook I had kept locked in the office safe since 1991. The one that contained 37 years of formulations, temperatures, timing adjustments, starter feeding schedules, was gone. The safe had not been broken into. The combination had been given willingly or changed, and the book had been removed and replaced with nothing. I stood in my kitchen and pressed both palms flat on the counter and breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, a technique I had learned in the mid-90s from a stress management pamphlet a doctor had given me during a particularly difficult quarter. It still worked if you committed to it. Then my phone buzzed on the table. A text message from a number I didn't immediately recognize. 8 words, no punctuation. "I need to show you something." Not by phone. I looked at the name above the number. Carol Briggs, our bookkeeper. 18 years. I typed back one word: "when." Her reply came in under 30 seconds: "tomorrow. Early. The Starbucks on Fairfax. I'll bring everything." I set the phone down and looked at Pete's number still on my recent calls list, and at Donna's folded note beside the sink, And at the card, James Holloway had left me 3 days ago, still face up on the table where I had placed it after the flashback and the coffee, and the slow accumulation of certainty that something larger than grief was happening around me. I picked up Holloway's card and dialed his number, and when he answered on the second ring, I said, "I'm going to need more than a bracelet, Mr. Holloway. Tell me what else Maggie left." Carol Briggs had worked for Owen's Bakery for 18 years, without ever once being the loudest person in the room. That was not passivity. I had learned the difference between people who were quiet because they had nothing to say, and people who were quiet because they understood that speaking cost something and preferred to spend carefully. Carol was the second kind. She tracked every invoice, every vendor payment, every quarterly tax filing with the focused attention of someone who believed that numbers told the truth, even when people didn't. And she had never once, in 18 years, brought me a discrepancy she wasn't certain about. She was already at the corner table when I arrived at the Starbucks on Fairfax at 7:15 in the morning. Coffee in front of her, untouched. A manila envelope on the table beside it, the kind with the metal clasp thick enough that the sides bowed slightly. She did not stand when I came in. She looked at me the way people look at someone they have been worried about and are relieved to see in one piece, and then she pushed the envelope across the table before I had fully sat down. "Oh, I printed everything 3 weeks ago," she said. "The night Earl was fired. I didn't know where to send it until Pete called me last week and gave me Mr. Holloway's contact." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, but did not lift it. "I want you to know that I documented this in real time. These aren't reconstructions. Every page has a date stamp." I opened the clasp and pulled out the first document. It was a wire transfer confirmation, the kind generated automatically by the bank and archived in the accounting software Carol managed. The transfer was for $4.5 million sent from the Owens Bakery operating account to a private LLC registered in Nevada called Crestline Culinary Partners. The date on the transfer was 6 weeks ago. 3 days after Maggie's funeral. My jaw tightened. I set the page down and picked up the next one. It was a signature page from a licensing agreement. At the bottom in the line marked, "Authorized Representative Owens Bakery," was my name. Richard J. Owens. The signature below it was not mine. I have signed my name approximately 40,000 times in 40 years of running a business. I know exactly how the R connects to the I, how the J sits slightly lower than the baseline, how the Owens trails into a habit I developed in my late 20s and never corrected. This signature had the shape of mine without the history of it, the way a photocopy of a painting has the image without the texture. "He used the temporary conservatorship order," Carol said, watching me read. Her voice was steady in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed steadiness, because the alternative frightens them. "In California, when someone files for conservatorship of another person's estate, which means they're asking the court to give them legal authority to manage that person's financial affairs, the probate court can issue a temporary order while the full case is pending. The temporary order gives limited signing authority. Daniel filed the petition in late July, claimed you had significant cognitive decline based on a physician's assessment, and the court issued the temporary order 8 days later." She paused. "He used that order to sign the licensing agreement as your authorized representative, which means technically at the moment of signing he had a legal instrument that gave him the right to do it." I looked up from the page. "Technically. The instrument was obtained through false pretenses," she said. "The physician's assessment, I found a copy of it in the files Daniel left on the shared drive before he locked me out. It describes symptoms you don't have. It describes a person I have never seen in 18 years of working beside you." Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. Someone told that doctor what to write, and it wasn't you. I set the signature page down and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose and held them there for a moment. $4.5 million. 37 years of formula temperature, timing the institutional memory of a business that had survived 3 recessions, a landlord dispute in 2003 that nearly ended us, and the particular difficulty of competing in Los Angeles, where every year brought a new trend that threatened to make honest bread irrelevant. Gone. Converted to a wire transfer and sent to a Nevada LLC in 3 days. There's more, Carol said. She reached across and turned to a page near the back of the stack. Look at the transaction history on the LLC, specifically the incoming wires from the month before Daniel filed the conservatorship petition. I looked. 3 transfers spread across 4 weeks totaling $840,000. The source on each transfer was listed as Hale Capital Group. I read the name twice. Then I set the page down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't trust your hands. Hale, I said. Marcus Hale, Carol said. I looked him up. He runs a private investment firm in Century City. Before that, he had a construction and development company that went into receivership around 2005. She met my eyes. I found a Los Angeles Times article from that year. There's a quote from you in it. I remembered the article. I remembered the reporter calling me, and I remembered choosing my words carefully because I was not a man who enjoyed public conflict. And I remembered that even the careful words had felt like more than I wanted to say. Marcus Hale had run his company the way some men ran cards, pressing every advantage, hiding what he could, and expecting that charm would cover the distance between what he promised and what he delivered. When it hadn't, when the projects had fallen behind, and the investors had started asking questions, and the receivership had become inevitable, he had looked for someone to absorb the blame. He had looked among other places at me. He had not found what he was looking for. But I understood now that he had not stopped looking. He funded Daniel, I said. It was not a question. $840,000 over 4 weeks, Carol said. Before the conservatorship filing, before the Crestline deal, before any of it. She finally lifted her coffee and drank, and when she set it down, her hand was not entirely steady. Richard. Carol said, her voice dropping slightly. Daniel reached out to Marcus Hale first. I found the email chain in the shared drive before I was locked out. Daniel contacted him in April, 2 months before Mrs. Owens passed. He knew exactly who Marcus was. He knew the history. She looked at me steadily. He chose him because of it. I looked at the stack of documents on the table between us. 40 years of a business I had built from flour and belief and pre-dawn mornings reduced to wire transfer confirmations and a forged signature on a licensing agreement, and $840,000 from a man who had spent 20 years deciding I owed him something. How long do you think I have before the Crestline deal closes? I asked. Carol pulled out her phone and checked something. The signing is scheduled for December 5th, she said. That's what the agreement says. Full transfer of intellectual property and brand licensing rights pending final due diligence. She looked at me. 4 months. 4 months. I thought about Holloway and his briefcase and his careful voice telling me that some of the documents in Maggie's file had dates attached to them that would not wait indefinitely. I thought about the bracelet on the table in my room on Cochrane Avenue, and I thought about the specific weight of a name you did not recognize written on a document you had not signed. Or send everything to James Holloway, I said. All of it. Tonight. I stood and picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. And Carol, thank you for keeping this, for knowing it would matter. She nodded once, tight and precise. 18 years, she said. I know what this place is. I walked out into the Fairfax morning with Marcus Hale's name sitting in my chest, like a stone I had swallowed without realizing it. And I understood for the first time that what was happening to me was not about a son who had grown selfish. It was about an enemy who had grown patient. Marcus Hale. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in 20 years, and I had been grateful for the silence. In the way you are grateful when an old injury stops aching, not because you have forgotten it, but because you have finally stopped waiting for it to come back. It had come back. I walked from the Starbucks on Fairfax to the bus stop on 3rd and stood in the morning heat and tried to arrange what I knew into a shape that made sense. The $840,000. The Nevada LLC. The timing 4 weeks before Daniel filed for conservatorship, which meant the money had arrived before the plan had a name. But Carol had said Daniel reached out first. In April. 2 months before Maggie was gone. Which meant the plan had a name long before the money arrived. Daniel had simply needed someone to fund it, and he had known exactly where to look. A man with a company called Hale Capital Group and an office in Century City and a 20-year-old reason to want me on the losing side of something significant. Daniel had found that man on purpose. In 2005, Marcus Hale had been the kind of man who filled a room by assuming he was entitled to it. He was 58 now, which put him around 38 in the year everything fell apart. Old enough to know better. Young enough to believe that knowing better was optional. He had run a construction and development company called Hale Properties, which at its peak had been responsible for 6 mixed-use projects across the San Fernando Valley, all of them financed with other people's money and built on the assumption that the market would keep rising long enough to cover the gap between what things cost and what they were worth. The market had not cooperated. By the fall of 2005, 2 of the 6 projects were stalled. 3 were bleeding cost overruns. And 1 had a foundation issue that an independent inspector had flagged 18 months earlier in a report that Marcus had, according to the lawsuit that followed, declined to share with his investors. The receivership, a legal process in which a court-appointed manager takes control of a company's assets to pay its debts, was filed in November of that year. The investors lost approximately $11 million. Several of them sued. The suits were settled without Marcus admitting anything, which was the part that had bothered me most. I had been called as a witness in one of the depositions. Not because I had invested with Marcus, I hadn't, and I had declined his invitation to do so in 2003, which had not pleased him, but because I had contracted with Hale Properties for a small renovation to the West 3rd Street building in 2002, and the attorney wanted my account of how that project had been managed. I told the truth, which was that the project had run 4 months over schedule, that the subcontractors Marcus used had been changed mid-project without explanation, and that when I raised concerns, I had been told the delays were standard and the concerns were unhelpful. Marcus had been in the room for my deposition. He had sat beside his attorney with the particular stillness of a man exercising great control over his expression, and he had watched me answer every question with a thoroughness that clearly cost him something. When it was over and we were both standing in the hallway outside the conference room, he had said quietly, and without the presence of anyone who might record it, "You didn't have to be thorough, Richard." I had said, "Yes, I did." He had looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I could not fully read, not rage exactly. Not the heat of it, but something colder and more considered, the expression of a man filing something away for a time when the filing would be useful. Then he had walked to the elevator and pressed the button and not looked back. I had thought about that expression occasionally over the years, the way you think about weather that passed without doing its worst. I understood now that the worst had simply been delayed. 2 days after my conversation with Carol, I took the bus to West 3rd Street. Not with any particular intention beyond the need to see the building with what I now knew behind my eyes to look at it differently. I got off at this corner and walked the half-block to the front of the bakery and stopped on the sidewalk. The sign above the door was gone, not the bracket. The bracket was still there, the black metal arm I had installed in 1987 when the original painted sign had weathered past dignity. But the sign itself, the dark green board with Owen's Bakery lettered in cream the est. 1984 in smaller text below, it had been removed and replaced with a backlit LED panel that read, Daniels in a sans serif script, and below it in smaller letters, a new chapter. My name was not on it. The year was not on it. 40 years of 6 in the morning and last customer at closing and the particular satisfaction of a business that had outlasted 3 presidents and 2 recessions, and it had been replaced with a font choice. I stood on that sidewalk for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the parking meter across the street tick through 4 cycles of its display while I processed what I was looking at. Then I turned and walked to the side entrance, which I still had a key for, or believed I did, and tried the lock. The key did not work. The lock had been rekeyed, which I had been told would happen, but the replacement key Daniel had promised had never materialized in the way that many things Daniel had promised in the last 2 years had not materialized. I went around to the front and pressed my face close to the glass to see if anyone was inside who might let me in. The floor staff were moving around the counter in the afternoon light, and I recognized 2 of them, and one of them saw me and looked away with the particular discomfort of a person who knows they are witnessing something they have been instructed not to acknowledge. I stepped back from the window. On impulse, I took out my phone and connected to the Owen's Bakery Wi-Fi network, which I had the password for or had had until that moment. The network appeared in my list, but rejected my credentials. I tried the old password twice. The 3rd attempt returned a message, incorrect password. Contact your network administrator. I stood on the sidewalk outside the bakery I had built from 2 hands and 37 years, and a belief in honest bread locked out of the Wi-Fi the same way I was locked out of the building, and I felt something move through me that was not anger and not grief, but some compound of the 2 that did not have a clean name. My phone rang. James Holloway. "Yeah, Mr. Owens," he said when I answered. "I've reviewed what Carol Briggs sent me. There's something in Maggie's file that addresses this directly, and I think you need to see it before we go any further. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" "Yes," I said. "And Mr. Owens bring the bracelet." Maggie had kept things her whole life. Not out of sentimentality, she was not a sentimental woman in the way people usually mean that word. The way that involves crying at commercials or holding on to ticket stubs from movies she had forgotten. She kept things because she understood that objects held information, and information was worth preserving. She kept receipts for appliances until the appliances died. She kept birthday cards in a shoebox organized by year. She kept the lease from our first apartment, a single page typed on a machine that left the letters slightly uneven because she said you never knew when you might need to know where you had started. I thought about this on the bus to Wilshire Boulevard the following morning, with the sealed plastic sleeve in my jacket pocket and James Holloway's card in my hand. I thought about Maggie knowing 14 months before she died that something was coming and choosing to prepare for it rather than warn me directly. That was her way. She had always believed that a warning without a remedy was just a different kind of panic, and that the useful thing was not to say trouble is coming, but to make sure you had what you needed when it arrived. Holloway's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Wilshire that had the quiet authority of a place where serious things happened without drama. The waiting room had leather chairs and no magazines, which I had always thought was the correct approach. A doctor's waiting room needed magazines because the wait was uncertain and the outcome was sometimes frightening, But a lawyer's waiting room needed only the understanding that you were there to do something that required your full attention. He was waiting at the door of his inner office when his assistant brought me back. He shook my hand, directed me to the chair across from his desk, and sat down without preamble. "Thank you for coming," he said. "And for bringing that." He nodded at the plastic sleeve I had set on the edge of his desk. "I want to start with the bracelet because everything else Maggie left connects to it." He opened a folder on his desk and turned it so I could see the first page. It was a document I recognized immediately, the format of a California revocable living trust, the kind of legal instrument that allows a person to place their assets in a structure that transfers directly to named beneficiaries upon death, bypassing the probate court entirely. In California, probate, the court-supervised process of validating a will and distributing an estate, can take 18 months to 2 years and becomes a matter of public record. A living trust avoids all of that. The assets transfer privately, quickly, and without a judge. Maggie established this trust 11 months before she passed, Holloway said. Not a will, a trust. The distinction is important. A will goes through probate, which means it can be contested in court, and the proceedings become public. A trust transfers outside of probate, which means no public filing, no waiting period, and no opportunity for a third party to challenge it in open court. He met my eyes. She chose this structure deliberately. She understood that a contested will would give Daniel's attorneys time and leverage. A trust gives them neither. I looked at the first page of the trust document. My name was the sole beneficiary. Everything, the house on Roxbury Drive, the savings accounts, and critically her 50% share of the Owens Bakery LLC, which she had held jointly with me since we incorporated in 1997, transferred to me directly upon her death. He has no claim, I said. As a matter of law, Daniel has no claim to anything in Maggie's estate. Holloway confirmed. He was never named as a beneficiary in any document she ever signed. The conservatorship petition he filed is based entirely on his representation to the court that he is your son, and therefore has a legitimate interest in your welfare. If that representation is false, or rather, if it is incomplete in a way that changes its legal meaning, the petition becomes vulnerable. He paused. Which brings us to the bracelet. I pushed the plastic sleeve across the desk toward him. He did not pick it up. He looked at it with the expression of a man looking at something he has been thinking about for a long time. When Maggie retrieved this from Children's Hospital in 2019, he said, "She told me she was doing it because she wanted the truth to have a physical form. She said, and I wrote this down because I knew I would need to repeat it accurately. She said, Daniel doesn't know what he is. But someday someone is going to tell him what he isn't. And when that day comes, Richard needs something real in his hand." My throat closed around something, and I swallowed it back down and breathed. She knew, I managed. She knew that Daniel's legal status as your son rested entirely on the adoption you finalized in 1993, Holloway said, which is a matter of record and completely valid. But she also knew that the adoption documents described Daniel as a foundling and infant of unknown parentage, and that a DNA test would confirm no biological relationship between you. He folded his hands on the desk. She was not trying to hurt him. She was trying to protect you. Those two things can coexist. The room was very quiet. On Wilshire Boulevard, 14 floors below, traffic moved in the way it always moved in Los Angeles, constant and indifferent, and somehow reassuring in its indifference, the city continuing its business regardless of what was happening in any particular room. She thought of everything, I said. Not a question. Not everything, Holloway said with something close to warmth. She didn't anticipate Marcus Hale, but the framework she built is strong enough to handle him. He reached into the folder and produced a second page. I've taken the liberty of contacting a private DNA testing service, the kind used in estate and custody matters, court-admissible results with a documented chain of custody. If you consent to a sample today, we can have confirmed results within 5 business days. He slid a consent form across the desk. One page straightforward, my signature authorizing a cheek swab collected by a certified technician in Holloway's office. I picked up the pen he offered. My hand was steady. I signed my name the way I always signed it, the R connecting to the I, the J sitting slightly lower than the baseline, the Owens trailing into the habit I'd had since my late 20s. My signature? Nobody else's. 5 days? I said. 5 days, he confirmed. And Mr. Owens, the crestline signing is December 5th. That gives us approximately 4 months. Maggie gave us the tools. We have time to use them correctly. I stood and picked up the plastic sleeve from his desk and put it back in my jacket pocket close to my chest, the way I had learned to carry things I could not afford to lose. Through the window behind Holloway's desk, the Los Angeles afternoon spread out in every direction, flat and bright and vast, a city that had watched me build something from nothing over 40 years, and was still, I was beginning to understand, watching. Tell me what you need from me, I said, and when you need it. Right now. Holloway said, I need you to go home and let me work. And I need you, if Daniel contacts you, to say nothing about any of this. A pause. Can you do that? I've been doing that my whole life, I said. Carrying things quietly, I'm very good at it. Earl Gibbs called me on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the party, and asked if he could come by. He did not explain why on the phone, which told me it was either something he could not say in words or something he needed to hand me directly. With Earl, it was usually the second thing. He was a man who communicated better through action than language. 30 years of working beside him had taught me that when Earl had something important to give you, he showed up in person. He arrived at my room on Cochrane Avenue at 10 in the morning, carrying 2 things, a paper bag with 2 coffees from the diner on Pico, and a metal box approximately the size of a shoebox. Its olive green paint worn to bare metal at the corners, a strip of electrical tape around the lid where the original latch had broken sometime in the 90s, and I had fixed it the way I fixed most things in those years, practically without elegance, in a way that held. I knew the box before he set it on the table. I knew it the way you know the face of someone you love, even when you haven't seen them in years, not by thinking about it, but by some recognition that happens below the level of thought. Earl sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and said, I pulled it out of the dumpster behind the building the morning after they cleaned out the storeroom. I didn't know what was inside. I just knew it was yours. I reached across and put my hand on the lid, but did not open it yet. The electrical tape was still intact. Whatever was inside was the same as it had been the last time I had closed it. Tell me what happened, I said. All of it. Earl Gibbs was 65 years old and had started at Owen's Bakery in 1994 when Daniel was 3 and still spent his afternoons sitting on the flour sacks, watching the bread come out of the oven with the focused attention of a child who has decided that something is the most interesting thing in the world. Earl had taught Daniel to roll dough when Daniel was 5, standing behind him, with both hands guiding the smaller ones, the way you teach anything worth knowing, by doing it with someone until they can do it alone. He had watched Daniel grow up in that kitchen, the way you watch something grow when you're paying close attention to something else, and the growing happens around you before you fully register it. He told me about the day Daniel came to him with the document. A printed form, 4 pages, with a line at the bottom for Earl's signature above the words, Witness Attestation Statement of Observed Cognitive Impairment. The document described a series of incidents in which Richard Owens had allegedly confused ingredients, mislabeled storage containers, and failed to recognize regular customers by name. Earl was asked to sign as a witness to these events. "To go every single thing on that list," Earl said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man stating something so far from the truth that indignation has passed, and only fact remains: I never saw. Not one of them. In 30 years of working beside you, I have never once seen you confuse salt and sugar. You check everything twice. You always have. "What did you tell him?" I asked. Earl looked at me steadily. "I told him I wasn't signing anything that wasn't true. I told him that I had been making bread in that kitchen since that boy was in diapers, and that I knew the difference between what I had seen and what somebody had written down and wanted me to say I'd seen." His jaw tightened. He told me that if I didn't sign, he would bring my employment file to his lawyer, and that there were irregularities in the inventory records that could be interpreted as theft. A pause. "There are no irregularities. I keep my own copies." But I understood what he was telling me. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my own situation. Earl had worked for 30 years with honesty as his only currency, and Daniel had tried to counterfeit it. "You didn't sign," I said. "I did not sign," Earl said. He picked up his coffee and drank. "He fired me that afternoon, 2 hours after I left his office. I got the call while I was driving home." He set the cup down. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel bad, Richard. I'm telling you because Mr. Holloway's assistant called me last week and said my account of what happened would be useful. And I wanted you to hear it from me first." I nodded. I did not trust my voice entirely at that moment, so I kept it brief. "Thank you, Earl." He waved in his hand the gesture of a man who considered thanks unnecessary for doing what was simply right. "Open the box," he said. I peeled the electrical tape back slowly the way I had always opened things I was careful with, and lifted the lid. Inside, folded on top of each other in the order I had placed them 20 years ago, were 3 things: a square of gray fabric, what had once been a piece of the sweatshirt the baby had been wrapped in the night I found him cut small with kitchen scissors, and kept, because I could not bring myself to throw away the first thing that had kept him warm. A photograph 3 inches by 5 taken at the hospital 2 days after admission, a 4-pound infant with a round face and clenched fists, and the particular expression of a person who has decided, without yet having language for the decision, that they intend to stay. And a single page folded in thirds, the discharge paperwork from Children's Hospital, dated December 23, 1991, with Daniel's temporary case number at the top and at the bottom under the line marked "Releasing Party, my name," and beside it the words "Prospective Guardian Pending Adoption Finalization." I stared at the photograph for a long time. He had his whole face in it, that baby. No reserves, no management, just the raw material of a person not yet shaped by anything the world had done to him. I had looked at this photograph so many times in the years before I put it away that I could have described it from memory. Looking at it now was different. It was the same face, and I was looking at it from the other side of everything that had happened since. Earl's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and turned it face down. "One more thing," he said. "Daniel posted something on Facebook last week about Mrs. Owens, a tribute. He said the word tribute the way you say a word when the thing it describes does not match what the word usually means. He used a photo of the two of them. From the Christmas party in 2019, I think there were a lot of people in the original." He cleared his throat. "You weren't in the one he posted." I looked up from the photograph in my hands. "He cropped me out." "Yes," Earl said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. I set the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. Outside on Cochrane Avenue, a truck was making a delivery to the building across the street, the hydraulic lift lowering with a sound like a long exhale. "Tell Holloway whatever he needs," I said. "Tell him everything exactly as it happened. Don't soften it." Earl stood and picked up his empty cup. "Wasn't planning to," he said. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at me with the expression of a man who has something more to say and is deciding whether this is the moment. Then he said it. "He wasn't a bad kid, you know, before all this. He used to know how bread was supposed to smell." The door closed. I sat alone with the iron box and the three things inside it, and the particular silence of a room where something important has just been said, and there is nothing adequate to say in response. Someone had signed the attestation document. Not Earl. Earl had walked out of Daniel's office with his integrity intact and his job gone, which was the trade a man like Earl would make every time without deliberating. But the document required a witness, and Daniel was not a man who accepted refusals as final answers. He found someone. I did not know his name yet, and I told myself that not knowing was acceptable for the moment, because Holloway's job was to find the seams in Daniel's case, and a forged or coerced witness statement was exactly the kind of seam that came apart under pressure. What I could do, what I had always been able to do in 40 years of running a business that required attention to what was actually happening, rather than what people said was happening, was keep collecting, document, verify, build the picture one piece at a time until it was complete enough to be undeniable. I was doing exactly that on a Tuesday morning 3 days after Earl's visit, when my phone rang with a number I recognized as Donna Mills. "Richard," she said without introduction, in the voice of a woman who did not waste breath on preamble. "Someone came to my door yesterday with a card, a thank you card supposedly from you. Very official looking. The Owens Bakery letterhead, your name at the bottom." A pause that carried weight. "I've known your handwriting for 40 years. That was not your handwriting." My jaw tightened. "What did it say?" "That you were stepping back from the business with gratitude for 40 years of community support, and that you were excited to watch Daniel lead Owens Bakery into its next chapter." Her voice had the precise flatness of a woman reading something that offends her. There was a photograph of Daniel on the front, smiling. The card was designed to look like a retirement announcement. Another pause. "I almost believed it, Richard. That's what I'm calling to tell you. I almost believed it because it was very well done. And then I looked at the signature again. I pressed 2 fingers against my temple and breathed through it. 200 cards. Carol had mentioned 200 cards sent to the full customer mailing list, 40 years of names and addresses, people who had been coming to the bakery since before Daniel knew what flour was. Every one of them had received a document telling them that Richard Owens had retired happily and that Daniel's leadership was something to celebrate. "I need to ask you something," Donna said. "Did you send any version of that card, any version at all?" "No," I said. "Good," she said, with the brisk satisfaction of a woman whose suspicion has been confirmed. "Then I need you to come get it." I kept it. I kept the envelope too, with the postmark. A beat. I also called 3 people on my street who shop at the bakery, and 2 of them still have theirs. I told them to hold on to the envelopes. I thanked her with a sincerity that surprised even me, and told her I would be there by noon. When I hung up, I sat for a moment with my phone in my hand, and felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite admiration, and was mostly the specific feeling of watching a 72-year-old woman outthink a 33-year-old with $840,000 and a Nevada LLC behind him. I went to see Donna first collected the card and envelope and the 2 additional copies her neighbors had saved. The cards were exactly as she described, professionally printed Owens Bakery letterhead that had been copied from our actual stationery, with enough accuracy to fool anyone who wasn't looking for the difference. The signature at the bottom was a reasonable forgery of mine, better than the one on the licensing agreement done by someone who had practiced. I photographed each card front and back with my phone before placing them carefully in a large envelope I had brought for the purpose. On the way back to Cochrane Avenue, I stopped at the Wells Fargo branch on La Brea, where I had banked for 22 years. I wanted to check the balance on the joint operating account, the one that, according to Carol's documents, had been used to send $4.5 million to the Nevada LLC. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, the number, whatever number remained, because I had learned over 40 years that there was a difference between knowing something and seeing it, and the seeing was what made things real enough to act on. The teller was a young man I did not recognize, which was not unusual. The branch turned over staff regularly. I gave him my account number and my identification and waited while he pulled up the account on his screen. Then he looked at me with an expression I had seen before on the faces of people who had information they did not want to deliver. "Mr. Owens," he said carefully. "The mailing address on this account was updated approximately 3 weeks ago. I'm showing a new primary address on file." He looked at his screen and back at me. "I'm not able to share account details with individuals who aren't listed as the current authorized contact on the account record. I'm sorry, sir." I kept my voice level. "I've had this account for 22 years. I understand that, sir," he said. He meant it. There was genuine discomfort in his face. The discomfort of the young man following a policy that he understood was being used in a way the policy had not been designed for. "If you believe the account information has been changed without your authorization, you can file a dispute with our fraud department. I can give you that number." He wrote it on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter with both hands, which I thought was a small kindness, the kind people offer when they cannot offer what you actually need. I took the slip of paper and walked out onto La Brea and stood in the September heat and understood that Daniel had removed my access to my own financial information with a phone call and an address change, a process that at most American banks required nothing more than a verbal verification of account details and a new mailing address. No in-person visit, no notarized document. Just a voice on the phone claiming to have the right information, which Daniel would have had, because he had grown up watching me handle our finances and would have known the account number and the answers to the security questions. I had my phone out to call Holloway when it rang in my hand. Holloway himself, as if the thought had reached him. "Mr. Owens," he said, "the DNA results came in this morning. 4 days early." A pause, brief and deliberate, the pause of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say and wanted to give it the space it required. "Can you come to my office this afternoon?" "Yes," I said. I was already walking toward the bus stop. "Good," he said. And then, because he was a man who used words carefully and knew when a single one was sufficient, good. The result was 4 pages long. I only needed the first line. Holloway's office had the same quality of afternoon light. It had the first time I came flat and professional falling across the desk without warmth or drama. The kind of light that made everything it touched look like evidence. He was standing when I arrived, which I noted because he had been sitting both previous times, and the standing told me he had wanted to be on his feet for this. The way people stand when they are about to say something they have been holding for longer than is comfortable. He did not sit until I did. The report was 4 pages produced by a testing service called Pacific Forensic Genetics, which specialized in estate and custody DNA analysis. The kind that produced results admissible in civil court, with documented chain of custody certified technician signatures on every handling record and a reference number that could be verified independently by any attorney or judge who requested it. Holloway had ordered it the day I signed the consent form. The standard turnaround was 5 business days. The results had come in 4 days early, which Holloway attributed to a cancellation in their processing queue, and which I attributed to the particular impatience of the universe when it has been keeping something waiting for 33 years. The first line of the report read, "No biological relationship detected between Subject A, Richard James Owens, DOB 3/14/1954, and Subject B, Daniel Thomas Owens, DOB 12/14/1991. I read it twice. Not because I needed to read it twice, I had known this since the night I found him known it in the factual and unambiguous way that you know things you have witnessed with your own eyes. I read it twice because there is a difference between a truth you carry in your body and a truth that exists on a document with a reference number and a certified technician's signature, and I wanted to feel both versions of it at once and understand what the difference was. The difference was this: the truth in my body had always had room in it for love, for the 33 years of mornings and meals, and a business built partly for the future of a boy I had chosen. The truth on the document had no room for any of that. It was 4 words and a date and a number. It was the cleanest possible statement of a thing stripped of everything that had made that thing complicated and human and in the end worth anything at all. The conservatorship petition is now significantly weakened, Holloway said. He was sitting again, his hands flat on the desk, his voice carrying the careful precision of a man who understood that what he was about to explain mattered more than how he sounded explaining it. Daniel filed the petition representing himself as your son, and therefore as a person with a legitimate familial interest in your welfare. Under California Probate Code, Daniel can still petition because he is my legally adopted son. The DNA results do not erase that relationship, but they do expose a critical problem. He presented a false impression of our relationship while using questionable evidence to claim I was incapable of managing my own affairs. That changes how the court views his credibility and the basis of his petition. A pause. The answer is yes, it does. Adult adoptees retain legal standing as children of their adoptive parents. But it also means the foundation of his petition, the implied claim of blood obligation, is false, and the physician's assessment he used to support it was obtained through misrepresentation. We file a response to the petition using the DNA results, and Earl's account of the coerced attestation and the temporary order becomes very difficult to sustain. I folded the report along its original crease and held it in both hands. What about the Crestline deal? The licensing agreement he signed using the temporary conservatorship order is the more immediate problem, Holloway said. If we successfully challenge the conservatorship, the authority he used to sign that agreement retroactively disappears. The agreement becomes voidable, meaning either party can move to invalidate it. Given that Crestline will not want to complete a $250 million transaction on the basis of a document signed by someone who turns out not to have had valid authority, they will almost certainly choose to void it themselves. He looked at me steadily. We still need to move carefully. The signing is December 5th. We have time. I nodded and stood and put the folded report in my jacket pocket, alongside the plastic sleeve with the bracelet. I thanked him and took the elevator down to Wilshire and walked out into the September afternoon. I took the long way back to the bus stop. Not deliberately, I was thinking, and thinking had always made me walk without paying attention to direction. And I found myself 2 blocks west of where I needed to be, on a stretch of 3rd Street. I did not usually walk. I was about to turn back when I saw it. The furniture consignment shop had been on this block since at least 2010. A narrow storefront with items arranged in the window to catch the eye of people walking past, with money to spend on things that had belonged to someone else. I had walked past it 50 times without looking. I looked this time because something in the window registered before I had consciously identified it. A shape, a proportion, the specific angle of a back leg that I recognized the way you recognize a person from behind, not by their face, but by the way they hold themselves, by the accumulation of small details that add up to a person you know. The chair was in the right side of the window, priced at $65, on a small white tag tied to the arm. It was a simple wooden chair, straight back 4 legs, the kind I had built myself in the spring of 1984 from a kit I had ordered from a woodworking catalog, because the bakery needed seating for customers who wanted to wait for their order, and I could not yet afford to buy furniture. I had built it in the apartment on Cochrane Avenue over 2 evenings with a set of tools I had borrowed from a neighbor, and I had stained it dark walnut, and I had carried it to the bakery on the morning of the day we opened and set it beside the door, and sat in it at 5 in the morning to wait for the first customer. I went inside and crouched beside the chair and turned it to look at the underside of the seat. The wood there was older and lighter, where the stain had never fully penetrated, and in the left rear corner pressed into the grain with the tip of a nail. Because I had not owned a wood-burning tool, were 4 characters, R.O. 1984. My initials. The year. Pressed into the underside of a chair that had stood beside the door of Owen's Bakery for 31 years, before someone had decided it was worth $40 and a trip to a consignment shop. I straightened up and stood in the narrow aisle of the shop, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the chair in front of me, and the DNA report in my pocket, and the bracelet in my pocket, and 33 years of a life I had built, pressed into 4 characters in old wood. And I felt something crack open behind my ribs that I had been keeping closed for the entire 2 months since Maggie died. Not loudly. Not in a way the woman behind this counter would have noticed, but fully the way things crack when the pressure has been on them too long, from too many directions at once. I did not buy the chair. I had nowhere to put it, and carrying it on the bus would have been impractical. And I understood that some things are not meant to be recovered, only recognized and held in the mind and carried forward in a form that doesn't take up space. I walked to the bus stop and sat on the bench and took out my phone. 3 missed calls from Daniel, all within the last hour. I looked at his name on the screen. I turned the phone face down on the bench beside me and watched the traffic on 3rd Street move in its indifferent, continuous way, and I let all 3 calls remain exactly what they were. Unanswered. For now. Daniel called 3 times the week before Thanksgiving. I know because I looked at my phone each time and set it back down, without answering, the way you set down something you are not ready to pick up yet, but are not willing to throw away either. The calls came on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, evenly spaced, as if he had scheduled them, which he probably had. Daniel had always been organized about the things he wanted. By November, the weeks had developed a shape. I woke early out of habit. 40 years of 4:30 mornings do not stop simply because there is no longer anywhere to be at 4:30, and I made coffee in the small kitchen on Cochrane Avenue and sat at the table with whatever I had been thinking about the night before. Some mornings it was the case, the documents, the timeline Holloway and I had mapped across 3 meetings in October. Some mornings it was Maggie, which was different, the kind of thinking that didn't go anywhere, but that I had learned to allow rather than redirect, because grief redirected becomes something harder and less honest. Some mornings it was Daniel, which was the most complicated kind of thinking, and the kind I was least able to resolve before the coffee went cold. Thanksgiving fell on a Thursday, as it always did, which is the kind of observation that only occurs to you when you are spending it alone. I had spent 41 Thanksgivings in Los Angeles, and I could count on one hand the ones I had spent without Maggie, and those had all been in the early years before we met, when the holiday had been a thing that happened to other people in other houses. And I had worked the morning shift at the bakery because the bread still needed to be made, regardless of what the calendar said. This Thanksgiving, I did not work. I sat at the table in my room with a container of turkey and mashed potatoes from the supermarket deli on Fairfax, the kind that came in a black plastic tray with a cardboard sleeve printed with autumn leaves, and I ate it with a plastic fork because I had only the one metal fork I had brought from Roxbury Drive, and I had used it at breakfast and not yet washed it. These are the specific indignities of living in a room when you are 70 years old, and I note them not for sympathy, but because they are true, and the truth of them is part of what happened that night. At 7 in the evening, I picked up my phone to call Maggie's sister in Portland, who was the person I would have called on a holiday if I had been in the habit of calling people on holidays, which I was not, and so I set it back down. I opened Instagram instead, because Earl had shown me how to use it in September when he wanted me to see the photo Daniel had posted of the bakery staff. And I had kept the application on my phone in the specific way you keep something you know is bad for you, because you have decided that knowing is better than not knowing. Daniel had posted that afternoon a photograph of the event space at the bakery set for a dinner that was clearly not a family dinner. Round tables for 10 white linens, small flower arrangements, the kind of setup you hired a caterer for. The caption read, "Grateful for the team that's building something new. Happy Thanksgiving." 83 comments, most of them from people I did not recognize. In the center of the photograph, used as the head table for what appeared to be 8 people, was the dining table I had built in the spring of 1990. From a set of plans I had ordered from a woodworking magazine. I had spent 3 weekends on it in the garage of the house on Roxbury Drive, cutting and joining and sanding, and Maggie had sat in a lawn chair beside the garage door, reading and occasionally handing me a glass of water, and when it was finished, she had run her hand along the surface and said it was the most solid thing I had ever made. We had eaten 47 holiday meals on that table. It had held 33 years of birthday cakes and Sunday breakfasts, and the particular quiet of 2 people who had been together long enough to eat without needing to fill the silence with conversation. It was now holding Amanda's centerpiece arrangements and 8 people I had never met. I closed the application and put the phone face down on the table and finished the rest of my turkey in the dark, because I had not turned the overhead light on when the sun went down, and I did not feel like getting up to do it now. Then because sitting in the dark with cold supermarket turkey was not something I intended to make a habit of, I got up and turned the light on and made another cup of coffee and sat back down, and I let myself go to the thing I had been not going to for months. The woman had come to the bakery on a Tuesday in October of 2001. Daniel was 10 years old and at school, which was the only reason I agreed to see her, because I would not have had that conversation in front of him at any age, but especially not at 10. She was thin and poorly dressed, and she had the look of a person who had been in trouble for long enough that the trouble had become structural, not a bad week or a bad year, but a bad way of living that had arranged itself around her like furniture. She told me her name, which I did not write down and do not remember. She told me she was Daniel's birth mother. She told me she needed money, and that if she didn't get it, she would be back, and that she had friends who knew how to make things complicated for a man raising a child on his own. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because it is not a story I have told before, and I am aware that telling it now to myself in a room on Cochrane Avenue while my son's dinner party photographs sit on my phone, requires a kind of precision that the original events did not allow for. What I felt in that moment was not heroic. It was not even entirely clear. It was the feeling of a man who has been handed a bill he did not incur and has to decide whether to pay it or dispute it, and who understands that the disputing will cost more than the paying in the currency that matters most, which is the childhood of a 10-year-old boy who does not yet know that any of this is happening. I paid it. I sold the 2 remaining satellite locations, the branch on Pico I had opened in 1996 and the one on Melrose I had opened in 1999 in 3 weeks, working through a commercial real estate broker I had used before and telling him only that I needed to move quickly and was prepared to accept below market value to do it. The combined sale brought in $1.8 million. I transferred it in 2 installments to an account she specified, and I had my attorney draw up a document relinquishing all parental claims, and she signed it, and that was the last time I saw her. Daniel came home from school that afternoon and ate a peanut butter sandwich at the kitchen counter and told me about a book report he had due on Friday and asked if we could go to the farmer's market on Saturday, and I said yes, and I made dinner. And I did not tell him anything, because there was nothing I could tell him that would help him, and everything I could tell him that would hurt. I had kept the receipt. Not the bank transfer records, those existed somewhere in the accounting files I no longer had access to, but the signed relinquishment document notarized and dated October 23, 2001, which had lived in the iron box under the square of sweatshirt fabric and the hospital photograph for 24 years. I picked up my phone and called Holloway. He answered on the second ring. "I'm ready," I said. "Tell me what we need before December 5th. Holloway said we needed one more thing. Not a document, we had documents. Not a financial record, Carol had given us everything the accounting system had held, and Holloway's paralegal had spent 2 weeks organizing it into a chronology that could be read in sequence and understood without legal training. What we needed, Holloway told me when I called him from the dark kitchen on Cochrane Avenue after Thanksgiving, was a person. Someone who had been in the room when things happened and was willing to say so clearly and on the record in a statement that could be submitted as part of our response to the conservatorship petition. "Jelkus," I said. "Earl," he confirmed. His account of the attestation document and the coercion attempt is the most direct evidence we have of bad faith in the original petition. A physician's report can be disputed as a matter of professional interpretation. A witness statement from a man who was asked to lie and refused is harder to reframe. A pause. "I'd like to meet with him before December 3rd. That gives us 2 days to finalize the filing before the signing." I called Earl that same evening. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting for the call, or something like it. Earl was not a man who answered his phone quickly, unless he had been expecting it to ring. "Tell me where and when," he said, before I had finished explaining. That was all. We met in Holloway's conference room on the first day of December, a Monday, with the winter light coming through the south-facing windows in the flat, directionless way of Los Angeles in December, which is not cold enough to feel like winter, but gray enough to suggest it. Earl sat across from Holloway's paralegal with his hands flat on the table and went through the attestation incident with the systematic precision of a man who had been turning it over in his mind for months and had arrived at a version he was certain of. He did not embellish. He did not editorialize. He described what Daniel had shown him, what Daniel had asked him to sign, what Daniel had threatened when he declined, and the exact words he had used in response. He gave those words in a flat, deliberate voice that carried the particular authority of someone who had said the same thing, once meant it completely, and had not needed to revise it since. Holloway's paralegal typed as Earl spoke, and when Earl was finished, she read the statement back to him, word for word, and Earl listened with his eyes on the table, and then looked up and said, "That's correct," and signed the bottom of each page with the unhurried signature of a man who signed things he believed in. Pete Saunders arrived 20 minutes later, having driven down from the warehouse in Chatsworth in the truck he had owned since 2004. He was carrying a manila envelope and an expression of controlled anger that I recognized, because I had seen it in Donna Mills and in Carol Briggs and in Earl, and I understood that it was the expression that honest people wore when they had been asked to participate in something dishonest and had refused, and were now finally at some cost to themselves in a room where the refusal was going to mean something. I recorded the call," Pete said, setting the envelope on the conference table. "I don't usually do that." But something felt wrong from the first sentence, and I had my phone in my hand, and I made the decision. He looked at Holloway. "In California, you only need one party's consent to record a phone call. I was the one party. I looked it up after to make sure I'd done it right." Holloway opened the envelope and removed a printed transcript 3 pages with a small audio recorder in a Ziploc bag beside it. He read the first page with the focused attention of a man cataloging ammunition. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, and the restraint in his voice was the restraint of someone who has been in difficult cases long enough to know that what feels like a turning point sometimes isn't, but who also knows, in this case, that it is. I sat at the end of the table and looked at these 3 men. Holloway with his folder, Earl with his signed statement, Pete with his phone recording, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing built correctly from the right materials. Not triumph. Not yet. But the feeling you get when the foundation is sound and the structure will hold. That afternoon, at Holloway's suggestion, I walked to the bakery on West 3rd one more time. Not to go in, I still had no key that fit the lock, but because Holloway had asked me to observe and document anything that might be relevant to the misrepresentation claim. I stood on the sidewalk with my phone and photographed the new sign, the window display, the menu board visible through the glass. Then I pulled out my phone and looked up the Owens Bakery page on Google where customers left reviews. The most recent reviews were not what Daniel would have wanted Crestline to read. 4 stars had become 3.2 over the preceding months. The complaints followed a pattern I recognized immediately, because I had spent 40 years listening to the specific language people used when bread disappointed them. Words like flat, dense, lacking. One reviewer, username Donna Mills 72, had written, "The sourdough I've bought here every Monday for 40 years changed sometime this fall. Whatever they did to the starter, the flavor is gone. This isn't the same bakery. 3 stars because the coffee is still decent." 11 people had marked the review as helpful. Holloway had told me that Crestline's due diligence process would include a review of customer sentiment data. A brand selling for $250 million was expected to have a quality reputation commensurate with that valuation. A declining review average with specific complaints about product quality changes in the months following a recipe licensing deal would raise questions that Daniel's attorneys would have difficulty answering cleanly. I photographed the screen with the reviews visible and emailed the images to Holloway with a subject line that said only customer sentiment for the file. He replied 4 minutes later, "Received. This helps." On the evening of December 3rd, Holloway called to tell me that our response to the conservatorship petition had been filed with the Los Angeles County Superior Court Probate Division. The response included Earl's signed statement, the DNA results from Pacific Forensic Genetics, Carol's financial documentation, Pete's recording transcript, the forged thank you cards Donna had collected, and the relinquishment document from the iron box, the notarized agreement from October 23, 2001, which established that Daniel's birth mother had legally and permanently surrendered any parental claim, and which made clear that Richard Owens had been the sole legal parent of record for 24 years entirely by choice and at considerable personal cost. "We're ready," Holloway said. "December 5th, Crestline's boardroom 10 in the morning. Dress like yourself, Richard. Don't dress for the occasion." I looked down at what I was wearing, the canvas jacket from 2003, soft at the elbows. The same one I had worn out of Daniel's party 4 months ago. "I was planning on it," I said, "before I reveal the shocking truth and the dramatic confrontation inside that closed boardroom. Drop a comment with the number 1991 or the word justice. So I know you're still here for this thrilling moment, and please note, the upcoming events include fictionalized details for dramatic effect. If this isn't for you, feel free to stop the video right here." I wore the same jacket I had worn the night I walked out of Daniel's party. This was not a sentimental decision. It was a practical one in the way that many things I did were practical first and meaningful only afterward. It was the warmest jacket I owned that still fit correctly, and December in Los Angeles was cool enough in the mornings to need one, and I had never been a man who dressed for occasions rather than for weather. But I was also aware in the part of my mind that noticed these things whether I asked it to or not, that the jacket was the same one Daniel had seen me leave in 4 months ago, and that he would recognize it, and that recognition was information I was willing to let him have. The Crestline Group occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Flower Street in downtown Los Angeles, which was the kind of address that communicated seriousness of purpose without having to say so directly. The steel and glass of it, the lobby with its minimal furniture, and its security desk, staffed by 2 men in identical gray suits, the elevator that rose without sound or announcement to the 22nd floor. I had been in buildings like this before, on the rare occasions when a business matter required it, and I had always found them slightly absurd, the way things are slightly absurd when they are designed to impress rather than to function. But I was not here to be impressed, and I was not here to be intimidated, and I walked through the lobby with my hands in my jacket pockets, and my breathing even and unhurried. Holloway was waiting at the elevator bank on 22. He was carrying his old leather briefcase and wearing the charcoal overcoat, and he looked at me when I stepped off the elevator with the expression of a man checking that everything he expected is in place. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," I said. One word was sufficient. The conference room was through a set of glass doors at the end of a carpeted hallway. Through the glass, I could see the table, long, dark wood, the kind that cost more than most people's cars, and the people arranged around it. 25 of them approximately in the configuration of a transaction meeting, the Crestline team, along one side their legal counsel at the near end. 3 men I did not recognize who had the look of financial advisors. On the other side, Daniel and Amanda, and beside them, 2 attorneys in identical dark suits, and further down the table, standing rather than sitting with his back against the far wall and his arms folded, and an expression of careful neutrality that I recognized as the expression of a man who believes he is about to win something, Marcus Hale. He had aged well in the way that men with money and no conscience often did. The years had sharpened him rather than softened him, and he wore his silver hair and his bespoke suit with the ease of a person who had spent 20 years deciding that what had happened in 2005 had been someone else's fault and had arrived at a comfortable certainty about it. I looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then I looked away because he was not what I was here for. Holloway spoke to the assistant outside the conference room, who made a brief phone call and then opened the glass doors for us with a small nod. The reason we were admitted was simple and had been arranged in advance. Holloway had contacted Crestline's legal counsel 2 days prior, identified himself as the estate attorney of record for Margaret Owens, and noted that the estate had a direct financial interest in the transaction being properly authorized. A $250 million acquisition team did not ignore estate attorneys of record. They called back within the hour Every head in the room turned when we entered. Daniel was on his feet almost immediately, the way people rise when they see something they did not expect and are not certain yet whether to treat as a threat or an inconvenience. He was wearing a dark suit and the navy silk tie I had bought him 2 Christmases ago, which I noticed before I noticed anything else, and which I set aside as information that belonged to a different kind of accounting than the one I was here to do. "What is this?" he said, and his voice had the careful evenness of a man working hard to sound calm. "Good morning, Daniel," Holloway said in a tone that was neither warm nor cold, but simply accurate. He set his briefcase on the nearest available surface, the credenza along the wall, and opened it. "Before this transaction proceeds, there is a matter of legal standing that Crestline's counsel will want addressed. My client has documentation relevant to the authorization of the licensing agreement and the conservatorship petition currently before the court." He removed a folder from the briefcase and placed it on the table. "I'll begin with the DNA analysis as it's the most direct." He slid the report across the table to the Crestline lead attorney, a woman in her 50s with silver-rimmed glasses and the focused attention of someone who had not reached her position by missing things. She opened it and read the first page without expression. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed the sealed plastic sleeve. I walked to the center of the long table and set it down where everyone could see it, the yellowed hospital bracelet inside the typed label visible through the plastic. "Baby boy unnamed received 12/13. 1991. This is the intake bracelet from Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I said. I had not planned to speak, but the room required it, and I found that my voice was steady in the way it had been steady at 4:30 in the morning for 40 years, which was to say completely and without effort. December 14th, 1991. I brought the infant who became Daniel Owens into that hospital after finding him in the alley behind my bakery. He had no name. He had no family on record. He had me because I was the only person who showed up. The room was very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight and texture that you can feel against your skin. Holloway continued reading from the folder, the conservatorship petition timeline, the physician's assessment obtained through misrepresentation, Earl's signed statement, the wire transfer to the Nevada LLC. The Crestline attorney passed documents down the table to her colleagues. No one on the Crestline side spoke. They read, and they passed, and they read again. Daniel had not sat back down. He stood at his place at the table with his hands on the back of his chair, and his knuckles showing white against the dark upholstery, and his face had the specific blankness of a person whose prepared version of events is being disassembled in front of them faster than they can reassemble it. Then he looked across the room at Marcus Hale. It was not the look of a man who had just realized he had been used. It was faster than that, and colder, the look of a man calculating in real time which version of events would hold up better. The one where he had been the architect, or the one where he had been the instrument. Marcus met his eyes for exactly 1 second, and I understood watching the two of them that they were not predator and prey. They were partners dividing a loss, and the only difference between them was that Marcus had been in this kind of room before and had prepared his exit in advance, that 1 second. That was where I saw it clearly for the first time. Daniel's face did not change the way innocent faces change. It settled. The way a man's face settles when he has run out of moves and knows it, and the only thing left is to decide what he is willing to say out loud. The Crestline lead attorney spoke first, because that was her job, and she was good at it. She set down the DNA report and folded her hands on the table in the deliberate way of a person who has made a decision and is now communicating it. Before we proceed further, Crestline will need to suspend today's signing pending a review of the authorization documentation. The licensing agreement as currently constituted was signed by a party whose authority to execute on behalf of the estate is now in question. Our counsel will be in contact with Mr. Holloway's office to discuss next steps. She said it without apology, without accusation, with only the weight of a professional conclusion behind it. Daniel's lead attorney leaned toward him and said something close to his ear. Daniel did not react. He was looking at Marcus Hale the way a man looks at his only remaining card when the hand has already been called. Not panic, not betrayal. Something colder than either the assessment of a person deciding in the space of 3 seconds how much of the truth he could afford to let go of. Marcus uncrossed his arms and straightened from the wall. "Daniel," he said in the measured voice of someone delivering information rather than news. "My involvement in this process was as an independent investor and business advisor. Whatever representations were made to Crestline were made by you and your attorneys. That's documented." A pause, perfectly calibrated. "I'd encourage you to speak with your counsel about your exposure here." Daniel looked at Marcus for 3 full seconds. Marcus looked back. What passed between them was not the look of a deceived man confronting the person who deceived him. It was the look of 2 men who had built something together and were now deciding in the wreckage who would carry the weight of it. Then Marcus picked up his jacket and walked out without looking at me, and the door closed behind him with the particular finality of a man who had prepared his exit long before the meeting started. Amanda left next. She did not look at Daniel. She did not look at me. She walked toward the same door with the focused efficiency of a woman who had already made every decision she intended to make, and the sound of the door behind her was small and clean and done. Daniel stood at the table alone. His attorneys conferred beside him. The Crestline team gathered documents with professional quiet. I watched Daniel because watching him was what I had been doing for 33 years, and because what I saw now was different from anything I had seen before. Not the face from the party, not the face from the microphone, but something underneath all of that, stripped of the arrangement. "Dad," he said. The word split down the middle on its way out. "She's not here," I said. "Not now. There's nothing in this room that finishes what needs to be finished between us." I followed Holloway to the elevator. Through the glass behind me, Daniel stood alone at the table, the ruins of a plan that had taken months to build, come apart in 45 minutes by his own hand. "He'll call," Holloway said. "I know," I said. The doors closed. She was gone by the time Daniel got back to the car. I did not witness this directly. I learned it the way I had learned most things over the preceding 5 months from Earl, who learned it from Carol, who had it from a contact at the building management company where Daniel and Amanda had been renting since June. The outline was clear enough. Daniel came down from the 22nd floor before noon. The car was where he had left it in the parking structure on Flower Street, but Amanda had not been in it. When he called her phone, it went to voicemail. When he called again, same. The 3rd time, the number had been disconnected, which is the specific kind of information that arrives all at once when you have been hoping it was something else. Earl came by Cochrane Avenue at 2 in the afternoon, carrying 2 coffees from the diner on Pico, same as before, as if the ritual made the conversation possible. "Cuidinos. Amanda cleaned out the joint account this morning," he said, still standing in the doorway. "The withdrawal happened at 8:45, an hour and a half before the meeting started." He set a coffee in front of me. "She left the divorce papers on the kitchen counter of the rental, signed on her end. She had a notary come to the house yesterday afternoon." Amanda had sat through 45 minutes of that conference room, knowing the account was already cleared and the papers were already signed. She had planned the exit the way she had planned everything, thoroughly in advance, and with complete understanding of what the moment required. What I felt was not satisfaction and not surprise. It was tired recognition. This was always what it had been. The only thing that had changed was that it was finished. Marcus moved on the Bel Air house this afternoon, Earl continued. Daniel borrowed against the property through one of Marcus's private lending vehicles. The default clause activated when Daniel missed the December 1st payment. The default notice was sent 3 weeks ago to the Bel Air address Daniel no longer monitored. He paused. He may not have known until this morning. Daniel called 7 times between noon and 5 o'clock. On the 4th call, I picked the phone up and held it until it stopped ringing, then set it back down. Not punishment. I had learned over 70 years that conversations that matter require a readiness that cannot be hurried. Earl left at 4. At the door, he paused. One more thing. Crestline called Holloway. They're prepared to void the licensing agreement. They're also still interested in the brand original valuation clean transaction whenever the estate is ready. Holloway will handle that, I said. He nodded and went down the stairs, steady and unhurried. I sat until 6. The December light through the window on Cochrane Avenue went from afternoon gold to flat gray, that 20-minute window Los Angeles offers before dark, when the sun drops behind the Santa Monica Mountains, and the city doesn't know yet what it's becoming. At 6:15, footsteps stopped outside my door. A pause. Then 2 knocks, uneven, the knock of someone whose hands were not entirely steady. Everything that needed to be in this room was already here. I stood up and walked to the door and opened it. He looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing, not the red around his eyes, not the absence of the tie he had been wearing that morning. Not the fact that he was holding his jacket rather than wearing it, despite the December cold. It was the size of him. He had always been tall, my son taller than me by 2 inches, since he was 17, and that height had never seemed like a thing he was particularly aware of until I saw him without it. He was still the same height, but he was standing in a way that made the height irrelevant. "Can I come in?" he said. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "No," and did not close the door. He absorbed that without flinching, which told me he had expected it. He reached up and put one hand on the door frame, not to push, but to hold himself the way people hold on to things when they are not certain their legs will manage without assistance. "The woman," he said. "The one who came to the bakery when I was 10. His voice was careful, the voice of someone stepping onto ice they are not sure will hold. Earl told me. Not everything he said it wasn't his to tell, but enough. He looked at me directly, which cost him something visible. "Was there really someone who came?" "Yes," I said. "One, and you paid." He stopped. His throat moved. "Earl said you sold the Pico and Melrose locations, both of them, that year." He said the years like they were weights he was lifting one at a time. I looked it up, public records. The transfers were both in October 2001. "They were," I said. He stood in the hallway, and the fluorescent light above him did what fluorescent lights in hallways do. It flattened everything, removed all shadow, made every surface look equally exposed. He had nowhere to put his face that the light didn't find. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. The question came out smaller than the others. The question underneath the other questions. I considered several answers. I gave him the true one. "Because you were 10 years old," I said, "and you wanted to go to the farmer's market on Saturday, and that seemed like the right thing for you to want." Something moved across his face that I did not have a precise name for. Not crying, his eyes were dry. Something before crying or after it, the expression of a person who has just understood the size of something and has not yet decided what to do with the understanding. I need to tell you things," he said. "I know that." I know what I did. His hand tightened on the doorframe. I just don't know how to start. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected. I want you to know that it was my plan. All of it. His voice did not waver on this the way it had on the other things. It was the steadiest he had sounded all evening, which told me it had cost him the most to say. Marcus didn't approach me. I looked him up. I called him. I knew who he was and what he wanted, and I used that. A pause. Amanda knew. She wasn't the one who pushed me into it. I'm the one who asked her to stay. He looked at the floor. I told myself it was about the business, about direction, about you not being able to see what the company needed anymore. He stopped. I don't think that's what it was about. I looked at my son, at this man I had carried through a hospital lobby in 1991, and watched, learned to walk, and taught to shake hands, and sent to school, and brought home and fed and worried over for 33 years, and I made a decision. Come back tomorrow morning, I said. 7 o'clock. Bring nothing. He nodded once. He straightened up from the doorframe slowly, the way a person straightens when they are deciding to hold their own weight again. Okay, he said. 7 o'clock. He turned and walked down the hallway. I watched him until he reached the stairs. Then I closed the door and went back to the table where the iron box was waiting on the shelf, and I began to think about what I was going to say in the morning. He was there at 6:55. I saw him through the window, standing on the sidewalk below in the gray December morning. Not checking his phone, not moving, just standing with his hands at his sides and his face turned slightly upward in the way people turn their faces when they are waiting for something and have decided that patience is the only currency they have left. I put on the canvas jacket and picked up the iron box from the shelf and went downstairs. We sat at the small table outside the building on the single bench the management had placed there, which held 2 people if they did not require comfort. The morning was cold by Los Angeles standards, 51 degrees, a thin cloud cover the kind of light that made everything look provisional. I set the iron box on the bench between us and told him everything. The alley, the hospital, the woman in October 2001 and the 2 locations I sold, and the document I had signed and the one she had signed. I told it in order the way I had always done things, beginning to end, without revision, without asking him how he was receiving it. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he sat for a long time with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the pavement. Then I opened the iron box and took out the bracelet and the photograph and the relinquishment document and placed them in his hands one at a time, the way you hand someone things that belong to them and always have. He held the photograph 4 pounds clenched fists, the face of a person who had decided to stay, and something broke open in him that had clearly been building for a long time, and he cried the way men cry when they have been holding something since before they had words for it. I put my hand on his shoulder and left it there. Then I stood because there was somewhere I needed to be, and the morning was not going to wait. Owen's Bakery opened at 6 in the morning. It always had. Earl was at the door when I arrived, along with 7 of the original staff people who had worked the ovens and the counter for years and had been let go or walked out in the months since July. Pete Saunders was parked at the curb in his truck, the back loaded with 50-pound bags of hard red winter wheat, the good kind, the kind we had always used. He was drinking coffee from a thermos, and he nodded at me when I came up the sidewalk as if no particular amount of time had passed, which was the right way to handle it. Holloway arrived at 8 with the papers. The transfer of Owen's Bakery into the Employee Cooperative Trust. Maggie's final instruction, drafted 14 months before she died, required my signature on 3 pages. I signed all 3 at the hood of Pete's truck because there was no other flat surface available, and Holloway witnessed them, and that was that. 40 years, 3 signatures. I looked up from the last page and saw Daniel standing at the far end of the block. He did not come closer. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched, and I watched him watching, and I gave him a nod that he returned, and that was enough for now. The battered wooden sign, Owen's Bakery Est, 84, dark green lettering on cream, was leaning against the brick beside the door. Earl had found it in a storage unit Daniel's team had rented and never sorted through. He had driven out to Van Nuys at 5 in the morning to get it. He rehung it while Pete held the ladder. Donna Mills appeared at my elbow with a sourdough loaf she had baked herself from the recipe she had memorized over 40 years of Monday mornings. "And your recipe," she said, "from memory." I broke the crust with both hands, and the smell came up yeast and thyme, and the particular warmth of something real, and I understood that some things made correctly and tended carefully outlast everything that tries to replace them. The sign went up. The name did not change. It never would again. I've told you this story because I needed to tell it, and because someone watching tonight might need to hear it. Here is what 40 years and 1 hospital bracelet taught me: love is not blood. Love is the decision you make at 2 in the morning when no one is asking you to make it, and you make it anyway, and you keep making it for 33 years without keeping score. I believe God puts certain people in front of us not by accident, not by coincidence, so that we can choose them. I chose Daniel. I would choose him again. But I also chose silence when I should have chosen truth. I carried things alone that were too heavy for one person, and I told myself it was protection, and maybe it was, but it was also pride. Don't be like me in that. The people who love you deserve the weight, not just the shelter. These grandpa stories I carry are not easy ones. This family story cost me more than I can count. But I've learned that the most important family story isn't the one about what you built. It's the one about why you kept showing up. If any part of this grandpa story stayed with you, a name on a bracelet, a chair you carved your initials into a door you weren't sure whether to open, leave it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's not too late. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be the right time. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain fictionalized elements built for reflection and understanding. If that's not what you're looking for tonight, no hard feelings, step away and find what fits you better. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.